if I had a reference to make as to my lineage, art historically, I think everybody comes from somewhere. You know, you can't avoid that. And you shouldn't try. I would like to think that, that my predecessor, long ages ago, might well have been a man named Giotto. I feel close to that imagery. But today I feel close to nobody except myself. And I'm very comfortable now to live in my own skin. There was a time when I kind of envied moves that other artists would make and tried at times to emulate those moves. But I'm not at all infected with that appetite now. I'm quite comfortable making my own way through whatever career I have left to explore. And I think it's going to be, if I have anything to do with it, it's going to be a long one. I do 60 push-ups every morning. Today I did only 50. Tomorrow I'll do 70. Well, I was born in a small company town in central Pennsylvania, from which I extracted myself as soon as I could at the age of 17 and departed for the big city. I loved my family very much, and I continue to love my family. I'm devoted to my family. I'm very sentimental about my family. In particular, my mother, who is 93 years old and in better shape than I am, and I'm grateful for that. And I was very devoted to my father, although in a very different way. He would walk into my studio. I remember being cautious and concerned about his reaction to what he might see on the wall. And I was rather taken aback when I found that when he did come into the studio, he looked only at the floor. He wasn't comfortable with what he saw. All he wanted to know was I making a living? And he was happy to hear that I was indeed making a living at that time. But the relationship wasn't damaged by that at all, because I knew him and he knew me, and we trusted each other. Well, I got out of Altoona very quickly. At 17, I left town after I graduated from Altoona High School. I wanted to go to art school. I came to New York with 2 scholarships. One to the Art Students League and one to a small facility called the American Art School on 14th Street. I went to both of them simultaneously, one at night and one during the day, and I lasted 1 month. I was a member of the WPA Federal Art Project in New York City from 1938 to 1940. It was a great experience. It certainly has not influenced my work, because I can think of nothing more distant from the work I did on the project than what you see on the walls in this room. But the great thing about the project was that every artist was making the same amount of money, so that there was no hostility, there was very little competition, there was a great camaraderie, which I enjoyed. Well, after the project folded, I had a wife and child to feed, and so I needed to make a living. I needed to replace the $21.77 a week somehow, and I found that I had better go into perhaps the commercial art world and become a graphic designer of sorts, with no experience in that field whatsoever. And the next day I walked around town, Madison Avenue, I believe, Vanderbilt Avenue, and in 48 hours I had a job. Well, I was a painter originally, but I somehow was attracted to heavy impasto globs of paint on a canvas. And when the paint began to fall on my shoes from the easel, I decided that I had better perhaps lay the canvas down on sawhorses. Well, gesso to me has been a very useful three-dimensional medium. I also use it in a flat sense, but I do work it with trowel I call it my trowel and error method. I'll move the tool through it and around it. I'll use my hands. I'll use any tool that comes to mind at that point to make the kind of mark that I wanted. It's a gestural activity. Back in 1963, I decided that the smartest thing for me to do would be to work with material more sympathetic to my three-dimensional appetite. And I began to work with found objects. And that first found object that I discovered and fell in love with was the cigar mold. Actually, it pulled me away from painting, which was my main activity then, and moved me toward a three-dimensional sculptural discipline. In 1968, after working perhaps for 4 years with found material, I said that, look, I don't want to use the same found material. I want to make my own found material. I'll make my own junk. I jokingly say, for me, it was a move from the found to the profound. But it was a good move because it allowed me a range of possibilities which I could not possibly have explored with that one single image, three-dimensional image of the cigar mold. I once had a show called Dimension Times 3, and I like that kind of definition of my work. It's dimension times 3. It's basically wall work, but it does have a tactility, a depth increased by my use of the overlay, a beckoning to the viewer of entering a kind of chapel or a kind of architectural aperture. These are wooden models which were tooled or milled out on a power tool or several power tools, basically dealing with the radius, the angle, the straight line, and usually the form which interests me is quite geometrical looking, hard-edged. I'm talking now about the original vocabulary that I designed in 1968. It reflects the motion and move and cutting ability of a power tool, basically, such as a router blade, a table saw, or a wood shaper. So the model is made with a power tool, with some refinement by a hand tool, perhaps, or a great deal of finishing. I've got a wooden model that took me perhaps 2 days to make, carefully, thoughtfully, all kinds of safety precautions taken at the tools so that I count my fingers at the end of the day and I wind up with 10, and I'm happy. To do that again, if I wanted 10 of those units, for example, to work with, it would be both philosophically and physically impossible for me. So I hit upon the system of mold making to reproduce them. Now, into a mold, one can pour plaster or Jell-O, or tapioca, or polyester resin, or cement. I chose to bypass the Jell-O and the tapioca and use polyester resin because it's much more durable than plaster. It's more versatile. I can paint it, I can sand it, machine it. cut it with a bandsaw. I make a very careful wooden model, and I take that wooden model and place it into a wooden box that is totally leak-proof. And then I pour into this container, which contains the original model, this glutinous, gelatinous, rather ugly stuff. It's rubber. And the next morning it is already vulcanized and cured, and I can extract the wooden model from it, at which point I can pour the polyester resin into it, and then extract the resin casting after that is cured from the rubber mold. Microballoons I came to fairly lately in the casting process. I came to it because I needed to cut down the weight of the fairly large pieces I was making, wall pieces. So I did some research and found out about these very tiny hollow glass spheres, which looks like flour or sugar, even finer than sugar, actually. It's like powdered sugar. It acts as a filler. It occupies space without adding any weight at all. And it acts as a buffer against the exotherm, which is created by the mix of the catalyst and the polyester resin. So it eats up the heat, and it reduces warping, and it lightens the final product. I must be very careful about ventilation. I have an exhaust system which takes care of that, and I wear a mask, and I wear rubber gloves. And I'm aware constantly of the hazards of working with toxic materials. And I caution anybody who works in the same manner to observe the same precautions. Through this deliberate diversion from found material, I learned how to cast, and I learned how to make molds, and I learned more than anything else that a restricted vocabulary has much more potential than a wide, endless range of possibilities. I found that, like the 12-tone scale in music, the potential is inexhaustible. And it's like the alphabet, of course, in the English language, the 26 letters. I have here perhaps 20 of my own letters. And as the castings began to be generated from the wooden models and the subsequent molds, the table became filled. And I've got boxes of this stuff up in the loft, which I have retired, castings which I'm no longer interested in. And what you see on that table are things that I consider current, things that may spawn a larger effort. These are simply, this is my sample case for my own information, and so that I have a record of the possible moves I might make in the casting and mold making process. Then in 1982, I began to become a little unhappy about the hard-edged geometric forms that I was working with, and I decided that I want something to show a sign of my hand a little bit, just a little more passionate, a little more gestural, a little more expressionist. So I, using the same system of mold making and casting, moved to this system of low relief mold, keeping in mind the interest I've always had in Babylonian cuneiforms and in ancient markings of all kinds. This relief was stained with a sienna wash to bring out the depth of the articulation, the markings, the gesture. And the markings were achieved by a variety of means. Sometimes my fingers, my hands, sometimes an impression of a metal object, and sometimes a dowel, and then finally I would take a rolling pin, perhaps, and just lay a piece of plastic over it and knock down the rough edges. Then if I liked it, I would trim it a little bit and set it up into a box and make a rubber mold so that I would have it available whenever I wanted for a casting. And what I like about this system is that they are very susceptible to unexpected joinings, marriages, blind dates which result in fantastic relationships, perhaps in a larger work eventually. In any case, totally unexpected. simply moving them around, seeing one touch one another, seeing the texture and the marking join with one another, or even deny one another, thereby becoming, in its own way, interesting. I don't know quite how to use this one. I have cut it, I like it as it is, but I've never been able to find a home for it that is a happy home. So it's in a kind of halfway house. Now, would the decision to be made be this, or would I invert the form in my right hand and choose this? I think I'd choose this because the deep relief would be sandwiched in between these markings. And for reasons which I can't explain, I don't know why decisions are made really in a studio. I'm not at all certain sometimes. They're made kind of chemically. Something tells me that this is acceptable and that an opposite move is unacceptable. I'm not certain how that is arrived at. Three pieces accidentally united and will take their spot in a larger format. So it's a three-dimensional job, really. Most of it accidental, but again, the manipulation of accident working happily in my behalf, if I'm lucky. It's a totally subjective choice, anyway, in the end. That's the way I work, actually, is that I will start from a core of exciting, to me exciting work, units, mostly three-dimensional, and this will spawn a surrounding architectural structure of wood or a painting or other castings. But basically the unit, the piece starts simply by pushing two pieces of material together and seeing what the shadows do, what the light does for it, and then I will build around it. You have the structure created by the mark of the power tool, and you have the structure created by the sign of my hand. And I'm torn between the two. Therefore, I combine the two most frequently, and they get along very well. Oh, I love the whole way of thinking of suggesting that there's more there than meets the eye. See, I know there's nothing behind this. There's nothing behind this, but there is a kind of drawing in of the participant, of the viewer, and of me as I look at it when finally it is declared finished. I have that vision when I retire totally, which is unlikely in any event. I would like to retire to a monastery, sit up on a high stool, and make collages for the rest of my life. Actually, it's a relief for me. I use the word relief as against exhaustion. From the very noisy, dusty, fairly dangerous work of making a construction. There are no power tools involved. I can very quietly make a collage with no sound over, nothing happening at all except the quiet activity of making decisions. It's a relief. It's a blessing. I don't think I'd be anything or want to be anything else. I find it enormously exciting to get up in the morning, not knowing what will come from your hand that day is very, very much of an adventure. I'm quite content to be in my own skin, in my own studio, with my own family, in my own territory here, beautifully embraced by my wife's sculpture, her landscaping. She builds form. She'll build a stone wall where there was a declivity before, or she'll uproot a tree where she needs a level field. I make a connection between what she did and what I do in the studio.
Abe helps me in my work.
Well, I don't help you that much,
yes,
but I have ideas that are useful to you.
You have a lot of ideas that are useful. There's only one thing where what you do can't be translated to mine, and that's scale. The outdoor scale,
as you know, I've reached for the suggestion of scale, working in a very small format, and I've even claimed that a small format can be monumental under certain circumstances. The size really has nothing to do with scale for me.
Well, in a way, if you're dealing with today on one of the jobs, there were lots of trees 90 feet tall.
90 feet tall?
90 feet tall. Now, when you were doing something on the ground level with 90 foot, that's what I mean.
I see what you mean, yes.
It's very hard to translate.
Of course.
And the ceiling is the sky. Neither one of us likes haphazardness and sloppiness and things seeming out of control. And in my opinion, it's very, very important to do that in the landscape because there is such a tremendous diversity of form. Just looking out now, you can see 500 shapes within 10 yards of here. Everything has a different shape, and it's all extremely complicated and busy, and there is no place to rest the eye unless you make it.
I've been terribly interested in the framing off process, isolating fragments of imagery, revealing selections that you couldn't possibly imagine if you did not mask it off. By isolating imagery within a restricted area, you become aware of moves that could only be arrived at through the Geiger counter framing off technique. There's something about masking off, there's something about isolation, which adds another element to a visual experience for me. It gives it a kind of mystery, a kind of value which it did not have naked, like so. See? If I frame that off, I immediately make it more useful. I take charge of it. It's no longer a fragment, it's my work, my decision. I consider this studio, for example, my masking off from a world which I find quite ugly and in many cases unacceptable, And therefore, this becomes a kind of isolation chamber for me of a good kind, of a positive nature. A cathedral, perhaps, my own cathedral, my own private religion. And I'm both the altar boy and the priest in this particular place of worship. And I do worship here. I worship a lot of abstract notions, and I make a lot of genuflective moves here. It's a big dig I work in. I've mined this dig for years. It's a vertical mine shaft. Actually, it's a core. You draw the core up, and there's 1964, 66, 68, but it's all in the same vertical shaft. It's all coming from the same underground resource. But what is sense in this particular art world? I don't know what sense is. But I've learned to accept to trust my work. I've learned at some great cost to trust what I'm doing. When I work at a piece, I start working on either a collage or a three-dimensional piece. And there's a pressure that builds up in me, an enormous kind of tension. And I come to a boil. I literally come to a boil, like a steam unit. I guess I know when it's finished, when that boil is pierced, to mix a metaphor, when I know, when the whistle blows, the top of my head goes up. Or two angels somewhere up at the top of the ceiling sing in chorus and say, "Abe, you had it, back off." Then the piece is finished.